it's interesting to see that, right, if you hold, let's say, the number of shots constant, but you then increase the number of documents, each of these different mechanisms are going to react differently with respect to performance. And same thing for the number of shots, right? So let's say you say, okay, fine, let's show the model a single document or 10 documents or 100 documents, but let's vary the number of shots, right? And then again, different mechanisms are going to react differently with respect to the performance. So then the question is, okay, fine. You said that there's all of this there's a relationship between the number of shots and the number of documents that we surface and that we retrieve and the performance. I want to know how many shots and how many documents I should show, given a particular budget. How do we go about it? Right. So that's kind of then they take a step back and they say, you know what, we have these sort of like scaling laws. We can help you predict what would be the optimal set of parameters. So is that's clear for everybody, right? I think you can see it here. I'm not entirely sure if each one of these is a different configuration, but you can just sort of see here that there's lots of different configurations. They might just produce lower performance. Well, we want to find the ones that produce the highest performance and to try to model the relationship between the hyperparameters and that performance. So that's what they're doing in section 5. It's basically a way they're trying to come up with to quantify the relationship and to predict it. I see there's some things in the chat. Okay. They're trying to predict it. Okay, so how they're going about it in section 5 is a couple of different ways. The first, I created this mind map. We have the inference parameters. Those are the things that Sophia already spoke about. So in the case of drag, so this is the vector theta. It includes a couple of things for drag, which is the number of retrieved documents and the number of in-context examples. And then iter drag is simply the number of iterations for retrieval and generation. The way they split it up, the section is into, first, let's construct the model, and then let's validate whether our construction makes any sense. So we're going to look at both, but before we do, Sophia, I believe that you put in the slides, no, in the chat earlier, that we do have some visual examples, and I'm not sure for people that hadn't yet looked at the paper, this might be particularly useful. So I think it really just started making sense once I saw this image. So you see basically, so the idea here is, I think, so we looked earlier at the plot that showed how RAG simply doesn't scale, right? Now we have this new technology and we have a bunch of context, right? And we can just continue to add more things into the context. Well, we're seeing that just doing it normally with RAG doesn't scale. We just keep plateauing. So then they come up with all these different other mechanisms. And so one of those mechanisms is to you basically dump a bunch of rags as examples into the context, right? We say, well, we can fit in now with 1 million or 2 million tokens. It could be like 40 or 50 different novels, right? Like you're just packing in so much. So you're like, all right, here are 5 documents, and here is a query, and this is how a single RAG example would normally work. This is what the answer that I expect from having retrieved these 5 documents. And each one of those is just a big example. And now you just keep showing them a bunch of different examples so that it learns how to filter through and discover the right answer from a set of different documents, because you've shown it a bunch of different examples of this. You can sort of see how they do it here. So anyway, below, if people are curious, you should be able to see the actual example of how they do it and what the query is. Okay, so again, so now we have these hyperparameters, which is like, how many documents should we be retrieving in the first place, and how many examples should we be showing it? Or how many iterations? And the idea is to try to find the optimal configuration. And so they did that empirically in the beginning, and now we're trying to model it. All right, so now let's see how they're going about modeling it. Okay, so this is the example. This is the equation that they're trying to fit. So P here, that's simply our performance. It could be accuracy. Theta is that hyperparameter vector, right? The one that includes the number of demonstrations, the number of documents, and the maximum iterations. And A and B and C are going to be learned. I is pretty interesting here. So I is essentially, so we have to in some way account for the fact that there's a different informativeness level for each data set, each task, right? So it could be the case that for one task, you're just giving me really bad documents and they're not all that informative. And so going from, let's say, 0 shot to 1 shot is already quite valuable, or going from no documents retrieved to any documents retrieved is quite valuable. So they're coming up with this other vector, I, that essentially measures the informativeness of both the documents and the in-context examples. And so that one is going to be very dataset specific. It's going to be very task specific, and we have to learn that for every single task. And essentially, that allows us to model the variance between the different datasets and between the different tasks. So this is the equation here. Try to break it down into some intuition too. So this is a vector that describes the informativeness of each additional document or each additional example. Y log theta here. So the way I put it is, since performance improvements often show diminishing returns, we introduce a logarithmic relationship. You don't sort of expect that as you keep tweaking, all of a sudden you're going to get this like emergent, like exponentially increasing performance. I don't think that's sort of the expectation. So plus you did see earlier that it increases, the performance increases linearly, but with the log, right? So I think that's kind of how they're trying to capture that intuition. We also, I think for modeling purposes, and I think there's also some intuition here, you're also modeling the performance in as an inverse sigmoid. And so if you were to try to directly model performance just as P of theta, it might be challenging because it's nonlinear, and they describe kind of like the nonlinearity and the sublinearity in the different regimes. So they went about trying to do it with the inverse sigmoid. Okay, so that's kind of how they're building up the framing. And so A, B, C, they're going to be discovered along the way. Here, what you can see is basically their prediction versus where the actual values lied. And then on the basis of that, they're able to then figure out kind of like what actually helped make the model very useful. So this is the 0 doc, 1 doc, 10 docs, 100 docs. So you can see that again, like performance continues to increase as you increase the number of shots and as you increase the number of documents retrieved, right? Everybody can see this. So they're increasing in essentially in both dimensions. You're not necessarily, we haven't necessarily predicted all that well for every single data set, but we tend to be sort of like within the bounds. So now we've moved away from the construction of the model. Now they're trying to validate it. So let's see if the model sort of like makes sense and in which regimes it makes sense. So the first thing that they do is kind of like this. You know, they predicted the performance, and then they actually measure the performance, and then they're running an ablation study. And so they're trying to kind of like turn off various knobs, and then they want to see kind of what the actual effect was. So in the first case, they're just excluding B. So you might remember B is the coefficient that is going to be learned for the inter task variance. So again, that one turned out to be quite important because when you exclude this, the performance drops, right? This is ultimately, we're going to go for 0.9. This is a 0.86. They also tried to model the log, is like, I think, the quadratic of the log, which also seems to be not as well as the linear one. A linear sigma and a sigmoidal sigma, you can see. So basically, this is their model, ultimately. Next, they are trying to figure out whether or not they can generalize from an unknown domain to a known domain. So this is, from the known domain to the unknown domain. This, in my opinion, I think is pretty important. And I'm not sure that I got a very clear sense from them that they generalize all that well. I think they say that they do, but I think I'm a little skeptical still, because basically what they're trying to say is, okay, perhaps we learned, and if somebody understood this differently, please correct me. one way you could go about this is, let's say you learn from all of these examples, but you're kind of like you're leaving some examples here for testing. Fine, but you've still kind of learned from all of these different tasks, and now you're trying to predict again within tasks that you had already seen, not examples you had seen, but tasks that you had seen. So that would be one way to go about it, but that doesn't prove to you that you can generalize well to unseen data sets, which is likely to be how it's used in production, right? So the other example might be, okay, let's say like learn on a couple of different tasks, let's say on these two tasks, and then see whether or not we're generalizing well to these unknown tasks. If that's been other people's impression, that's good. Otherwise, please let me know if you've read that differently. Um, because that feels to me like that is probably the most important thing here, and I would expect to see much more written on it. Um, in either way, I think that the fact that you still have in the inference time, you still have to derive I, right, from the target domain, which I think makes it, I don't know how people would go about actually kind of operationalizing this now, like actually deriving this. So I don't know, maybe in the Q, if we have some time for Q&A afterwards, I'm very curious about how people would think about operationalizing this like I derivation. So that's the first thing that they're doing. They're trying to say, okay, like, does it actually generalize? And it seems to them that it does. The next is, can we extrapolate from lower effective length to higher effective length? So this is kind of what they're doing here. Actually, maybe you can see it in the diagram. We don't have in this example. I think it might be in the example Sophia showed. If you learn this regime here, would you be able to extrapolate the performance over here? That's kind of, I think, how they're trying to do, to frame this. And the answer is yes, sometimes. You can sort of extrapolate, but depending on on which which regime you're transitioning from. So from 16K to 32K, okay, the almost like the the Oracle prediction, the best prediction is going to be 39. You can predict 37.4. This is for the exact match. So you can sort of do a decent job from 16K to 32K. From 32K to 128K, it's not good. And from 128 to a million, still decent. Let's see, 48 versus 50. 1 million to 5, not good, right? So they're saying, okay, we'll just keep it below a million. That should be good. But extrapolating from 32 to 128, that's challenging because, as you saw before, the drag performs best around 32K. Iter drag excels at long complex, so we almost have kind of like a phase transition here. So that's how they're trying to model the length. Okay, some discussion here too. One thing they point to as very important is retrieval. The more documents you include, you are increasing your recall. It doesn't stop, right? Like at some point you're gonna get to like 100%. Fine, but all of the other metrics, they don't seem to be increasing all that much. And you might be introducing noise. So they talk about this divergence. This divergence suggests that while more documents lead to better recall, the relevance and ranking quality do not improve proportionally and even introduce extensive noise. The takeaway for them is that we have to be investing in much better methods of retrieval. So that's in retrieval, and I think they also point to, we have to invest in retrieval, and we have to invest in making sure that which we are retrieving is also accurate. And they point to this as another thing to focus on. So we have retrieval here. Then they break it down into the different sources of error. And they say we have, inaccurate or outdated retrieval, incorrect or lack of reasoning, hallucination or unfaithful reasoning, and evaluation issues or refusal to answer. Evaluation issues, refusal to answer, that might be, let's say, like when you have like a date that is misformatted, right? So first category highlights the need for enhancing retrieval methods and maintaining reliable and up-to-date knowledge base, especially for complex questions that rely on multiple supporting facts. There's something here that's kind of interesting too, which is like, how do you highlight the the relevance of a particular document, and they have some like sorting mechanism and like a ranking mechanism, and then on the basis of the rank, I don't know if they put that in any one of the diagrams, but on the basis of the rank, they they place the highest ranking document closer to the query. Well, that sounds like a whole other set of hyperparameters that can be explored, right? Like, what if you jiggle this? What if you, yeah, I don't think they put that here. But this one here, it's almost like the the documents that are closest to the query are ones this at inference time that are most likely to be the most useful. Sounds like a little bit like witchcraft. Long context modeling. We find that retrieving more documents is generally beneficial for RAG performance. Nevertheless, naively extending the context length in each generation step does not always lead to better results. I think I have another thing here. The model's ability to identify relevant information from extensive context remains to be improved, especially when presented with large quantity of similar documents.